You make no friends in the pits and you take no prisoners. 1 minute you're up $500,000 in soybeans, and the next, boom, your kids don't go to college and they've repossessed your Bentley. Are you with me?
The revolution starts now.
We have to pass the bill so that you can find out what is in it.
Turn those machines back on!
You are about to enter the Peter Schiff Show.
Show me the money!
If we lose freedom here, there's no place to escape to. This is the last stand on earth.
The Peter Schiff Show is on.
I don't know when they decided that they wanted to make a virtue out of selfishness.
Your money, your stories, your freedom. The Peter Schiff Show.
Well, April Fool's Day came late this year. It came on April 2nd, otherwise known as Liberation Day. That's the way President Trump billed it. You know, he also talked about it as a second American Independence Day, which is maybe a little bit more appropriate than Liberation Day, because really all he's going to liberate Americans from is their access to low-cost consumer goods. And in the short run, even before the tariffs have had a chance to work their way through the economy, he's already liberated Americans from a lot of their unrealized stock market gains. In fact, today, the Dow Jones dropped by over 2,200 points, just over 5%. This is the third worst point drop in history, not percentage, because it's only about 5%, but it's the third biggest point drop. I think the other two big ones were during the COVID collapse. In fact, this was the worst week in the stock market since the beginning of the COVID pandemic. In fact, I think most of the major averages were down maybe about 8% on the week. A lot of that carnage was today. Actually, the Dow was down 5.5% today. Since it peaked, the Dow is now down 15%. So now it's in full-blown correction territory. I said this was coming last week. You know, we weren't in a correction yet in the Dow, but we are now. The S&P is a lot closer to bear market territory. It was down 6% today. It's down 17.5% now since its peak. The NASDAQ composite is in bear market territory. It was down about 5.8% today. The NASDAQ 100 was down 6.2% on the day. So the entire NASDAQ is now down 22.7%. So it has joined the Russell 2000, which was in a bear market as of last week. And I mentioned that it was the first of the major indexes to hit bear market territory. And I said it wouldn't be the last, it would be the first, and it would lead the way for the other indexes. And the Russell 2000 is now down 26%. But it's the only index really that didn't close on the lows. It rallied a bit. On the low, the Russell 2000 was down 27.7% from its peak. So it was only down 4.4% on the day. You remember, I did a podcast called The Consensus Trades Are About to Unravel. And that was on January 24th. And I almost nailed the absolute top in the market, because since then, the NASDAQ is down over 20%. So almost the peak of the market. And I was pretty sure we were getting a big sell-off based on all of the wild enthusiasm that investors had based on the Trump trade and how everybody thought it was going to play out. Well, so far, it's been the opposite of what the consensus thought. If you bet on America, you bet wrong, because the U.S. stock market has been getting killed. Now, up until today, the foreign markets were immune to it. In fact, my dividend payers fund yesterday, even with the big sell-off in the U.S. market, my dividend payer fund was actually up. And as of yesterday, it was up 19.5% on the year. So it was having a great year. It was number one in its categories. You know, the entire category was up, but my fund was up about double the category average because of the types of value stocks that we own. They were, more growth oriented. didn't have, more value oriented than the typical portfolio, more of a focus on dividend yield. So we were doing really well in the rotation. But even foreign markets got clobbered today. But the interesting thing, and I'm going to talk about that in the podcast, was what really hurt today was China's retaliation. And I'm going to get into all that. But the foreign markets didn't go down when Trump announced tariffs. They really went down because China retaliated with tariffs of its own, which is a mistake for China to have made. I mean, the best thing that you could do in response to tariffs is nothing, because tariffs always do the most harm to the nation that imposes them. But often politicians respond in kind, either because of ego, they want to act tough, or they follow the interest of a special interest, because there are always narrow special interests that benefit from tariffs at the expense of the broader population that suffers. That's always the problems with democracies. And I thought maybe China won't have that problem, because it's not a democracy. And so that should be an advantage in situations like this. Instead, China imposed these retaliatory tariffs to our retaliatory tariffs. But I heard somebody on television ask, if tariffs are so bad, why do so many countries have them? Well, minimum wage laws are bad. Most countries have those. I mean, just because a country does something doesn't mean it's a good thing. But not every country has a minimum wage law, and the countries that don't, have better labor markets and have more prosperity than most of them that do. But the reason that they have tariffs is tariffs will always benefit somebody. I've talked about the Jones Act on this program. Why do we have the Jones Act? I mean, the whole country is poor because of the Jones Act. Well, you got a few people that make a ton of money off the Jones Act. And they give a lot of that money to the politicians that make sure it never gets repealed. They have a lot of skin in the game. They have a lot to lose if the Jones Act is repealed. So they give a lot of money to these politicians. And so the Jones Act stays, because the people that benefit from the Jones, that are hurt by the Jones Act, I mean, it's everybody, but what is it? A few $100s a person? Nobody really knows. And no one person stands enough to gain in order to, make the kind of donations that will match the small group of people that has hundreds of millions at stake. Well, that happens with tariffs. You have an industry that wants to be protected from competition. They want to be able to charge higher prices and make more money. How do you do that? Well, you bribe some politicians to impose tariffs. And now the tariffs enable you to do what the free market would have prevented you from doing. So you win, right? And that, you get to charge more, but your customers lose. But, the customers don't know. And no one customer loses enough money to offset what the business that's being protected gains. But, Trump's tariffs are not really going to protect American industry, because the industries that we want to protect, in the most cases, don't even exist anymore, right? Like talk about the shoe industry, right? Because Nike is one of the stocks that it got clobbered this week. 52-week lows, really getting killed because, they import their shoes, and they're going to be subject to like a 40% tariff. But we don't really have a shoe industry anymore in this country. 98% of our footwear are imported. So we're not protecting the American shoe industry when the shoe industry is gone. Now, maybe the tariffs are designed to resurrect the industry from the ashes, but how long is that going to take? I mean, it's just not even going to happen, right? Why would a company like Nike try to build a shoe factory in America? I mean, who knows how much that would cost and how long it would take. But we also don't have the supply chains that they have, in foreign nations. So how do you resurrect that, right? So it's a huge process that would cost a fortune. And why even take the gamble? Because you don't know how long the tariffs are going to be in place. So you can't really afford to make the investment. The best thing for Nike to do in response to these tariffs is just, allow their U.S. market share to diminish, although it won't diminish because everybody is in the same situation. All the shoes are imported. So shoes are just going to get a lot more expensive. And so Americans are going to buy fewer shoes. That's it. Maybe somebody who would have bought Nikes will buy a cheaper shoe that's now more expensive than it used to be, but it's the only one he can afford because he can't afford the Nike anymore. But Nike will just sell fewer shoes in America. They're not going to build a factory in America. That's never going to happen. So Americans are just going to pay more money for shoes, and they're not going to buy as many shoes. Now, Nike's factories are still going to produce shoes, so they'll sell those extra shoes that Americans can no longer afford to buy. They'll sell them to somebody else. Now, maybe they won't get as much money as they used to get from the Americans, but it's better than building a factory here. And of course, a lot of the shoes that Nike sells, they sell these shoes all around the world. And these other countries don't have these tariffs. So why would they build a factory in America where the only place they can sell those shoes is in America? They want to have economies of scale. They want to have the factory, then ship the shoes all over the world. It's the tariffs are not going to accomplish what the president is hoping to accomplish. And of course, the whole premise behind the tariffs is wrong. Donald Trump claims that the world has been screwing us over. They've been taking advantage of us. And that's why we have these huge trade deficits. And so what we need to do is level the playing field with tariffs. And that's going to solve the problem. And now they can't take advantage anymore because we're going to make them pay for the privilege of supplying us with goods. But it's our privilege to be supplied. They're the suckers for supplying us with goods that we can't really afford to pay for. The reason that we have trade deficits is not because foreigners have tariffs or because they're cheating. That's got nothing to do with it. The problems are in our economy, right? Not the foreign economies. We are uncompetitive in most of the manufactured goods that we import. That's why we import them, right? If we could produce all those goods cheaper, then we would be doing it. The reason we're not is because we're more expensive. Now, if we produce those goods in America, nobody would buy them because the Americans would buy the cheaper imports. So that's why we don't make them. And so it's not about the tariffs, but also Americans overconsume. We consume a lot more than we produce. And so that means in order to fill that void, we have to import. If we could produce enough to satisfy our demand, we would do it, but we can't. And one of the reasons for this excess consumption is because we have artificially low interest rates and easy credit. Well, one of the reasons we have artificially low interest rates is because the foreigners who sell us all this stuff that we really can't afford and didn't make, they loan us the money. I talked about that on a prior podcast, but it's an important fact to repeat that the way the world has been working, the Federal Reserve prints money, creates inflation, and Americans get that money, and then they spend it on imported goods. We can't spend it on domestic goods because we don't make them. But fortunately, the world is making stuff, so we buy that. We send our cash out there. They send their goods in here, and we're doing great because we get to consume all this stuff, and we didn't have to suffer any inflation because we exported the inflation. Right? If the Fed just printed a bunch of money and Americans had to buy only what was in America, prices would go through the roof because we don't have any stuff. But we take that money and we go shopping all around the world and we suck in all that stuff and we export our inflation. Now, that means the rest of the world has less stuff to consume. Because if we didn't buy all that stuff, they'd still have it. See, Donald Trump and a lot of his advisors say that, oh, the world needs America because we're their best customer. Well, we're their worst customer because we don't really pay. But if you can produce it, you can consume it. The world doesn't need America when there are billions of people outside of America that would be happy to consume what we're consuming. They don't consume it now because we outbid them with our overvalued dollar, which is overvalued because it's the reserve currency. And we exploit that to buy all these goods that the rest of the world would otherwise get to consume, but we outbid them with our stronger currency. But if the dollar crashes, well, then, we're the ones that can't afford it and they could buy. Remember, it is supply that creates demand, not the other way around. If demand created supply, there'd be no poverty, right? Poor people want all sorts of things. The constraining factor is supply. The cards are held by the people who supply the goods. Trump thinks we have all the cards because we buy everything. No, they have all the cards because they make everything. That's the hard part. Right? It's easy for China to consume what they produce. It's impossible for us to consume what we don't produce. So if all trade ended between, let's say, the United States and China, China still has all their factories. They still produce all their stuff. And so now their own citizens consume it instead of us. What are they out? Meanwhile, in America, all we have is our paper. So the government sends paper to American citizens that we print, and they have nothing to buy. So which country is worse off? The country that gets all the goods or the country that's stuck with all the paper, right? So they've got the cards. Trump just doesn't understand the game that's being played. But he is correct in his assessment that what's happening is a bad thing. Yes, we are indulging our present, but we're sacrificing our future. We're selling off our cows to buy milk. But these trade deficits are symptomatic of the underlying problem in the economy, that we don't produce enough, we consume too much, we don't save enough, we don't invest enough, we have this bubble economy. That's our fault. Now, yes, the rest of the world has enabled that by financing this, by financing our trade deficits and recycling them to finance our budget deficits. But to recreate the type of economy that Donald Trump wants to create, in order to do that, all of that inflation is going to move back from Wall Street to Main Street. We're going to reverse the process, because if we impose these strict tariffs, the money is not going to go out, where imports are going to be so expensive that Americans are going to import less. So the money stays here and the goods stay there. They don't come in. So we have more money chasing fewer goods. That bids up prices. But also the whole economy implodes, because without the goods to sell, right, the service sector economy that it enabled collapses. So we're in a massive recession. But also, if we're going to build the factories that no longer exist, right, if we're going to, reestablish the supply chains, the trade routes, train the workers, where is all the money going to come from to do that? Right? We don't have it. Americans have to stop spending and start saving so we can free up resources. But if our whole economy, the GDP, is based on everybody spending, everything implodes. But the problem is the government is running such massive deficits. How are we going to finance the reindustrialization of America and build all those factories and cover the cost of the deficits? Because remember, if the foreigners aren't recycling their trade surpluses, then they're not buying any of our bonds. That means the $26 trillion of Treasury debt that matures in the next 4 years, Americans have to finance that. Plus, if we go into a recession, the budget deficits will be $3 or $4 trillion a year. We got to loan that money to the government too. Well, how are we going to loan all this money to the government, but then pay for the build out of all these factories? It is impossible to do. So the government has to dramatically cut spending, including for Social Security, Medicare, national defense. We probably have to default on the debt, because there's no other way that we could free up the resources to make the investments that we need to make to actually create this industrial revolution that Donald Trump thinks he just unleashed. Anyway, I got a lot more to talk about. We're going to take a quick commercial break, and we're coming right back. Today's podcast is brought to you in part by Stash. Are you still putting off saving and investing because you'll get to it someday? Stash turns someday into today. With Stash, there's no more confusing, frustrating gatekeeping to keep you from investing. Saving and investing can feel impossible. But with Stash, it's not just a reality, it's easy. Stash is an investment app that allows you to automate your investing and implement strategies to help you reach your financial goals faster. You can personalize your investment portfolio based on your unique goals and investment philosophy. Stash has enabled millions of Americans to reach their financial goals and starts at just $3 per month. Don't let your savings sit around. Make it work harder for you. Go to get.stash.com/gold to see how you could receive $25 towards your first stock purchase and to view important disclosures. That's get.stash.com/gold. Paid non-client endorsement. Not representative of all clients and not a guarantee. Investment advisory services offered by Stash Investments LLC, an SEC registered advisor. Investing involves risks. Offer is subject to terms and conditions. Investment advisory services offered by Stash Investments LLC have not been vetted or endorsed by me or Euro Pacific Asset Management. All right, I'm talking about the tariffs. And, first of all, a lot of people I've noticed think, hey, Peter, what's going on here? Why are you not in favor of this? Haven't you always said that the U.S. has to get back to manufacturing? We have to get back to production. We do. We absolutely have to do that. But the tariffs are not going to accomplish that. That is the problem. I admire the president's goal. He's just going about it the wrong way. And in fact, these tariffs are actually going to do more harm to American industry than help. Yes, there will be some businesses that are helped, but more are going to be hurt. Look, a lot of companies in America that manufacture don't really manufacture, they assemble, right? But they still have a facility, but they bring in all the components. Like I used to use the example of Callaway golf clubs, which are made in the United States. We make Callaway golf. But we import the head, we import the grip, and we import the shaft, right? So that's the whole club. So, but they're all made someplace else. They all come into the United States, and they just stick them together, and then they sell them. Well, now Callaway is going to be uncompetitive because now it's got to pay a tariff on all the components it's importing to make that golf club. And a lot of American businesses, import a lot of stuff. They're going to be less competitive at home and abroad because of these tariffs. But the tariffs are not going to resurrect dead industries. It's just never going to happen. Now, Donald Trump also thinks, well, it's these foreign companies that are going to rush to build factories here in America to avoid these tariffs. No, they're not. The American market is not that important that they're going to do that. They will focus on foreign markets, right? And they will just sell fewer goods into America. They're still going to sell to Americans, right? We're still a big market. We won't just be as big because a lot more Americans will be unable to afford the products. And they might start making like a cheaper line. Now, look, it's interesting what Mercedes said. I think they just said, we're just going to discontinue our low-end cars. We're not even going to bother to sell them in America anymore because we know that after the tariffs, that low-end consumer won't be able to afford the Mercedes. So they just leave the market. But that means whatever U.S. cars are still competing for that market, now they can charge more because they don't have to compete with a Mercedes. But the top of the line Mercedes, sure. If you were paying $120,000 for a Mercedes, all right, now you're going to pay $160,000, right? So, people might still be willing to do that if they want the brand new Mercedes. But they'll just take those other cars that they're not selling to America. They'll sell them in China. They'll sell them someplace, right? But they're not going to do what Trump thinks. So, yes, I want America to reindustrialize. I realize the short-term pain that is going to require. I think it's worth it. I think we got to do it because the longer we wait, the worse it's going to be. But Trump thinks it's all going to be a boom. It's going to be, we're going to boom like we've never boomed. It's going to be this huge prosperity. It's ironic because Donald Trump says, countries have been ripping us off for years. And that's why we have such a weak economy under Biden. Well, they were ripping us off under Trump too. See, Trump says that while he was president, we had the greatest economy in the history of the world. Well, during those 4 years, our trade deficits got worse. So even though we were getting ripped off under Trump by the rest of the world, we still had the greatest economy in the history of the world, right? Which is all inconsistent, right? I mean, there's no truth to anything. He just says whatever he wants to say. But the world's not ripping us off, but we are deindustrializing. That is true. We have hollowed out the middle class. That is true. But China didn't do that to us. Canada didn't do it. Mexico didn't do it. We did that to ourselves, right? And just imposing these tariffs isn't going to do it. Now, I want to talk a little bit more on the fraudulent nature of these tariffs and the fact that they're illegal, they're unconstitutional, because tariffs are a tax, right? The taxing authority in the U.S. Constitution rests in Congress, and more specifically in the House, because all revenue bills must originate in the House. Now, why is that? Well, when the Constitution was first written and we had two houses of Congress, the senators were appointed to 6-year terms by the state legislatures. Congress was elected by the people every 2 years. And so the framers thought, if you're going to raise taxes on the public, then you're going to have to answer for that every 2 years when you ask the public for your votes. So by forcing the House to be the body that raises taxes, they thought that it would be much harder for taxes to be raised, because you have to go back to the same voters whose taxes you just raised and say, reelect me. So the founding fathers wanted to make it hard to raise taxes, which is a good thing, right? They didn't want the government to get bigger and raise taxes. Trump raised these taxes on his own. He's not accountable to anybody. He's got 4 more years and then he can't run for re-election. So we have a politician who doesn't have to worry about being accountable to the people, raising taxes on the people. That's wrong. That violates the very spirit and language of the Constitution. Now, how can he do it? Well, one way is he creates a phony emergency, because Congress gave the president power to impose tariffs when there's an emergency. Now, I don't even think that authorization is constitutional, because the Constitution doesn't say that the executive branch can delegate its authority. I mean, the congressional branch can delegate its authority to the executive branch. I don't even think that should be allowed. The executive branch has the authority for a reason. It's called checks and balances. So you don't give up your checks and balances. So I think the whole idea that you just let a president do it is wrong. Look, if there's an emergency, let the president make his case to Congress and let Congress deliberate on it and pass it, But this time, it's not even an emergency. See, he manufactured this fake, COVID deal. I mean, not a fentanyl. Now, I'm not saying that we don't have a fentanyl problem. We do. And that's just because we have our own war on drugs. But it's not Canada's fault. It's not Mexico's fault that we have all this fentanyl, right? But Trump is trying to blame Canada and Mexico on the fentanyl so he can use it as a fake emergency to justify his tariffs, right? So I think that whole thing was illegal. But what about these reciprocal tariffs? Well, Congress passed another law that they never should have, that said that if a nation has a tariff on us, that we can reciprocate in kind by imposing a tariff on them. The president could do it on his own. So if a country imposes a 10% tariff on our cars, we can impose a 10%. The president can, without congressional authorization, go back and do 10% on them, right? Tit for tat, reciprocal. But that's not what Trump is doing. He's pretending, and that's probably a generous word. It's more like lying. The president is lying that the tariffs are reciprocal, because he is imposing tariffs on countries that have no tariffs at all. And the tariffs that he's imposing far exceed any of their tariffs. So how is it reciprocal? Because the president, when he made his speech announcing, Liberation Day, and you notice I have to keep drinking because I still haven't recovered my voice yet. It's coming back, but it's taken a long time to get it back. But anyway, yeah, he had these big charts, and he showed like how much all these countries tax us. If somebody was like, they tax us 60%, so we're going to tax them 30%, right? They tax us 50%, we're 25%. And he said, see, I'm being a nice guy. I'm not really reciprocating. I'm only tariffing them half as much as they tariff us. Now, again, first of all, the tariffs aren't on them, right? When Trump imposes a tariff on Chinese goods, he's not tariffing China. He's tariffing Americans who buy Chinese goods. Now, it has an effect on Chinese companies that sell to America because they can't sell as much because Americans can't afford to buy as much. But it's the Americans that are being taxed, and it's the Americans that pay, right? But these countries are not taxing their citizens anywhere near what Trump claims. And so what did he do? Trump and his advisors came up with their own formula to try to create tariffs that don't exist. They basically looked at each country individually and said, okay, how much trade do we have, imports or exports? What's the size of our deficit? And they created a formula to compare the size of the deficit to the size of the overall trade and to come out with a percentage. And they therefore assumed that that percentage amounts to a tariff. So we pretended that's a tariff, and then we impose our own tariff to reciprocate for their make-believe tariffs. And we set our tariff at about half of what we were pretending their tariffs were. Now, this isn't real reciprocity. This is a scam. So the president is actually exceeding his authority, right? Somebody should challenge this legally. Congress should do something about it. But, the president has too much political support in the Republican Party for anybody to go after him like this. But, the Republicans were criticizing Biden for usurping power and doing things that he was not authorized to do, like with the student loans. But now Trump does the same thing. And if you don't criticize Trump, then you're a hypocrite. And of course, if both parties let their incumbents get away with this, then more and more power is diverted to the executive branch, which is not where it's supposed to be. Meanwhile, Congress has already ceded a lot of its authority to the regulators who are passing all these regulations that have never been passed by Congress, right? So, none of this is working the way it's supposed to. But these reciprocal tariffs are not reciprocal. And, in a way, Trump has just assumed that, well, if we have a trade deficit with a country, it's basically because they're cheating. They have some kind of artificial barriers and they're cheating. And therefore, we need to impose tariffs to level the playing field. It's kind of like that disparate impact kind of nonsense where, the government will look at a bank and they'll say, well, if you have a disproportionate number of loans to African Americans, right, then you must be racist, right? If you're not, if African Americans are, let's say they're 20% of a population in an area, but they only got 10% of the loans, that must be because you're racist. Because if you weren't racist, they'd have 20%. Well, no, there are other reasons that explain that other than racism. But they were saying, well, we don't care. We're just going to assume that any disparity that varies from the percentage, right? So if African Americans are 20% of a given population and they don't have 20% of the jobs or 20% of the loans or 20% of something, if it's less, if it's 10%, we're just going to assume it's racism, right? Well, that's what Trump is doing with trade deficits. Every country we have a trade deficit with, it can't be fair and square. It's got to be because the other side cheated, and we're going to retaliate, with these tariffs. And one of the ways you can tell that that's ridiculous is that the tariffs that Trump claims that each of these countries have, right? In theory, they apply to every other country. They're not nation specific. It's not that these individual countries have tariffs on goods coming from America. They have tariffs on goods coming from outside their country, right? All the countries are facing the same, make-believe tariffs. But there are a lot of countries that we have trade deficits with, and other countries have no problem having trade surpluses with them or balanced trade. America has a trade deficit with basically every single country in the world. And so is every single country cheating? They're all cheating. They're all out to screw us. The whole world, every country just wants to screw America. When of course they're not. They're just screwing their own citizens because they're the ones that pay the tariffs. No, right? But yes, it's easy to scapegoat, right? Just like, immigrants are always an easy scapegoat when there are problems. And one of the reasons you can scapegoat the immigrants is because they don't vote. I mean, legally, they're not supposed to, right? But I mean, they may be voting illegally. But it's always good to say, oh, yeah, it's these immigrants. That's the reason we have this problem. And Trump could say, yeah, we have these problems because the rest of the world is taking advantage of us. And I'm not going to let them take advantage of me anymore. And he gets a lot of support. That's great, right? I'm tired of letting the world walk all over the United States. They're going to pay for the privilege of selling us their stuff. Right? And it's asinine. When Trump gave his speech on Liberation Day, he talked about, the good old days when the country ran on tariffs and other indirect taxes. And we had no income tax, no Social Security tax, no corporate income tax, right? We had a tiny government at the time. And when you have a small government, you don't need big taxes. You don't need direct taxes, right? Direct taxes were supposed to be for wartime. That's why they made it so hard to enact them. That's why they have to be apportioned. And in fact, the only reason that the government was given the constitutional authority, the federal government, to levy a direct tax was in case there was a war. That was it. I mean, if it wasn't for that, it wouldn't even be there. And they wanted to make it difficult, so they used the apportionment requirement. But excise taxes didn't have to be apportioned; they just had to be uniform. That means they just have to be the same everywhere, right? So if you're gonna put a tax on cigarettes, you got to tax all the cigarettes. You can't favor one brand. You can't say, well, we're going to put this tax on Philip Morris cigarettes, but we're not going to put them on some other company, right? They have to be uniform, and you can't say, well, the tax applies in Georgia on one rate and it applies in New York at another rate. No, it's got to be the same rate. So all the cigarettes all over the country pay the same tax, right? That's uniformity. That's the requirement for the Constitution. But Donald Trump, he talked about the fact that we used to run on tariffs. And then he said, and for some unknown reason that nobody can explain, we decided to have an income tax, right? For some unknown reason that nobody can explain. Now, the reason is not unknown, and a lot of people can explain it, including me. But I mean, I'm not the only one. I mean, it's pretty obvious. So does Trump really not know the reason? And did he really go around asking people, hey, in 1913, they passed an income tax. Does anybody know why they did that? And everybody's like, no way, got me, no idea. Who knows why they did it? Nobody knows, right? It's a mystery. It's one of the unknown mysteries of the world. Nobody knows why they decided out of the blue to have an income tax, right? Now, so did that really happen? Or does the president know? And he just doesn't want to be honest, because if he had asked anybody, I mean, he could just, I'm sure if I haven't tried it, I'm sure if he just went to Chat GPT or Grok, he'd get the answer right away. In fact, he could just Google it. Why did they create the income tax, right? He'd get the answer, right? But the answer is simple, but it's an answer that he would not want to acknowledge. The income tax came in really as part of the populist movement in the United States. That's the movement that led to the popular election of senators. I mentioned that senators were appointed. Well, part of that populist push was for the people to have more of a say in the government. And so let's elect the senators instead of having our state representatives appoint them. So that was one thing that happened. But another thing was the income tax. Now you'd think again, well, why would the people, right, want the income tax? Why would the income tax be popular? Because it didn't fall on the people. The income tax was designed, at least sold to the public with this design, to soak the rich. It was to get Carnegie, Rockefeller, Vanderbilt, right? Not just the 1%, the equivalent of the billionaires. So imagine if we didn't have an income tax today, right? And somebody said, hey, look at Elon Musk. Look at, Mark Zuckerberg. Look at Jeff Bezos. Let's tax these guys. They're so rich, they can afford a tax. You know how much the first income tax was? It was like 4% was the top rate. Went from 1% to 4%. That was it, right? In fact, they thought about capping it. Initially, there was a debate. Should we cap the income tax at 10%? And there were some people that said, no, because if we cap it at 10%, they might actually raise it to 10%. That was the fear. So, hey, let's not cap it because we don't want to encourage them. So they should have just had a lower cap, right? They should have capped it at 4 where they started it. But how many people would oppose an income tax that only hit the billionaires with a 1 to 4%? I mean, even the billionaires might be okay with it, right? So it was a populist movement to tax the rich. Now, what was the middle class and the poor? What were they getting out of it, right? It wasn't just tax the rich for the sake of taxing them. There was a big benefit to the middle class. It was the elimination of the tariffs. So the populist movement got rid of the tariffs. Why? Because the tariffs were paid by the middle class and the poor. And the middle class and the poor knew that, right? They weren't idiots, like apparently the people at the Trump administration. They knew that they were paying the tariffs. Nobody believed it was coming from some external source. Everybody knew the tariffs are a tax on the people. Yeah, the rich paid tariffs too, but they didn't care, right? They were rich and the tariffs were incidental because they spend just a small portion of what they earn. So if something was 10 or 20% more expensive, they didn't care. They didn't pay attention to the price anyway. But if you're middle class and you're, counting your pennies and clipping coupons and stuff, 10, 20% means something to you. And so in order to pay for the lost revenue of giving up the tariffs, they replaced it with the income tax. That was the trade-off. Hey, we will get rid of this tariff, and in exchange, we're going to tax the rich. Well, that's why it was popular. The point is that now Donald Trump wants to bring back the very tariffs that the people wanted to get rid of. Now, given the fact that the country ran on tariffs for so long, don't you think the people who spent a lifetime paying tariffs, don't you think they had some idea of who bore the cost? I mean, who understood tariffs better, right? Americans in 1890, 1900, 1910, who had been paying them for decades, or Americans who never even gave them a second thought, right? Right. The people who lived on tariffs were happy to get rid of them. And they were happy to put an income tax on the rich because they didn't have to pay it. Now, of course, camel's nose under the tent. as soon as they got that income tax in, they didn't waste any time in jacking up the rates. And by the Second World War, everybody was paying them because of the victory tax and the withholding tax. Now, I'm sure that if the people in 1910 had been told that the income tax would eventually apply to them, and they would have to spend, a good portion of their spring gathering up all their receipts and keeping all their records and hiring accountants and reporting their income to the government every year and paying a percentage of what they earned and keeping all these books and records, they would have said, fine, we'll keep the tariffs, right? Because the tariffs are very easy tax to pay, right? You just buy a product and the tax is included, right? I mean, nobody has a big deal paying a sales tax, right? It's the income tax that is a burden to pay, right? And so the public was suckered into making this deal with the devil. The government told the middle class, let us impose an income tax on the rich and we'll take the tariffs off you. Now, the middle class is being soaked with an income tax that's much higher than was ever envisioned for Carnegie and Rockefeller. And now Trump wants to kick the middle class when they're down because they're already paying the income tax. They're paying the Social Security tax, which didn't even exist back then because there was no Social Security in 1913. So they didn't have that payroll tax. So now the middle class paying the payroll tax, paying the income tax, and now they want to pay the tariffs too, right? So it's a third shot at the poor and the middle class. Trump just doesn't get this. And he says, well, I'm doing this for the workers. What workers is he doing it for? There are a small group of unionized workers, right, probably, who will benefit at the expense of a lot of other workers who will suffer, right? The ones who are going to benefit, yeah, they're there applauding everything and cheering Donald Trump. And, you can, have a press conference and have a photo op with the people who benefit from your tariffs, right? That's easy for politicians to do. This is the seen and the unseen, right? So you can see who benefits, but you don't see all the people who suffer. I mean, you might see them, but you might not connect the dots between their suffering and the tariffs. But more Americans are going to see their wages cut or eliminated completely because of the tariffs. And all workers are going to pay higher prices, including the ones who benefit from the tariffs. Yes, I'm going to get a higher wage because my company now can charge customers higher prices so they can afford to pay me a higher wage. But now when I take my wage and go spend it, everything I buy is also going to be more expensive. The people of 1913 had it right. They understood that tariffs were taxes on the middle class and the poor. The people in 2025 don't get it, right? With all of our schools, right? Back in 1910, the average person didn't even graduate high school. I mean, if you got through middle school, that was educated, right? A lot of people, even some of our billionaires, the Carnegies, Rockefellers, right? These guys didn't even graduate high school, right? The billionaires of the day. I mean, forget about college. These guys made it to like 7th grade, 8th grade, and then they went on to be billionaires, right? And so if they didn't go to college, I mean, the average guy didn't. So the average guy didn't go to college, yet he still understood tariffs better than people with master's degrees in economics, apparently, that work for the U.S. government. But the bottom line is we're not going to accomplish anything that we set out to do. Now, there are people that are saying, well, maybe it's all a negotiation tactic. Well, what is he trying to negotiate? What is he going to get? Nothing. Unless he wants to manufacture a phony victory, he's going to take the tariffs away when he can come up with some phony victory to say, aha, you see, look, I got this, right? And I didn't actually have to do the tariffs. But look, he's already opened up the can of worms. I don't know if you can put the worms back in the can. I mean, the stock market was an accident waiting to happen, right? I mean, it was the most overvalued stock market. It was priced for perfection. This is like, you throw a match in a powder keg, right? That's what he did. So I don't know if even calling off the tariffs is going to call off the bear market. And, I mean, and how do you have any confidence in an administration? Tariffs, no tariffs, tariffs, no tariffs. I mean, how do you have any idea, any certainty? How do you do anything, right? When any given morning, Trump could wake up and decide, yeah, let's put the tariffs on, or who knows? So I think that he can't unscramble this egg. Yes, it would probably be somewhat helpful if he immediately canceled all these tariffs, but I don't see how he could do that because he just made such a big deal about them and how great it's going to be and how this is the secret to the new American revolution and our new independence and our liberation. How is he going to go like it was just an April Fool's joke on April 2nd? I mean, how is he going to do that? He's kind of vested. And I think the Republicans are in a bind because they don't even want to challenge the legality. Because let's say there's a group of Republicans that side with the Democrats and get rid of these tariffs. Now Trump's going to say, oh, these traitors, they got rid of my tariffs. And now that's why we're not going to have this economic boom. The tariffs would have created this big boom, but these traitors in the Republican Party, they ruined it, right? So the Republicans don't want to do that. So they'd rather just sit back and allow the complete collapse because then, they can't be blamed because Trump could always pretend things would have been great if the tariffs had stayed. So you have to leave the tariffs in to prove that they're a disaster. And of course, Trump has handed a gift to the Democrats, which is very unfortunate because the Democratic Party was in disarray. I think they lost the independence. They were even losing some of their base with all this nonsense, woke stuff and crazy stuff. When you have guys like Jon Stewart, calling out the Republicans, the Democrats, and Bill Maher and these guys are like, hey, you guys left me. They had a problem. Donald Trump tapped into a lot of disgruntled Democrats. This is going to hand those voters back to the Democrats. They're going to have a great issue to run on because we're going to be in a recession. Look, I can't even believe you got all these economists that say, well, the recession odds have ticked up a bit. Now they're 30% or 50%. I mean, come on. The Atlanta Fed has got the Q1 GDP at minus 2.8, and Q1 is over. We didn't have a trade war in Q1. We didn't have a bear market in stocks in Q1. I mean, so if we were in contraction without all this bad stuff, how's the economy going to expand in Q2? In fact, if you look at what happened today in the markets too, I wanted to go over this, but oil prices collapsed. They dropped. They were at $71.70 2 days ago. They're down to $62.60. Why did oil price collapse? Because of global recession. The Australian dollar down 4.5% today. It was up 1% yesterday, down 4.5%. Why did it go down so much? Because it's sensitive to commodities, and commodity demand goes down in a recession. Copper was down 9% today. What? I mean, that's because the markets are pricing in global recession. Silver was down 7% too. I mean, gold was down like $80, which was about 2.25%. Right. So people say, hey, gold went down. It's not a safe haven. It's still closed above 3,000 for the third week in a row. And the S&P was down 6%. So gold was down a lot less than the S&P, even though it's gone up a lot more than the S&P. So its purchasing power held up. You can almost buy 3 times as much, because S&P went down 6, gold went down 2, right? So gold gained a lot of purchasing power. You buy 4% more stocks today than you could yesterday with an ounce of gold. But why does silver get clobbered? Because of the industrial part. Everybody is pricing in a recession. Bond yields. Now, the yield on the 10-year is now below 4%, 3.99, I think, but just below 4. Now, the 30-year is at 4.41. So the yield curve is really steepening. But why? Why are rates going down like that? Because of recession. Right? They're pricing in global recession. There are people that actually think that maybe Trump is doing this on purpose. He's crashing the stock market on purpose. He's creating a recession on purpose so the Fed will cut rates. Right? This is his game plan, right? I mean, what an asinine plan if that's what he actually has. But people are hoping, okay, now the Fed can cut rates because inflation is coming down because look at oil prices, look at bond yields. This now gives cover for the Fed. We just need unemployment. Unfortunately, the jobs report we got today was better than expected, right? So the market didn't get what they're hoping for. But I think there are a lot of layoffs coming in the government. They didn't show up in this report because they were still working when they began the report. You see, if you're working for one day during the period, even if you're laid off at the end of the period, you still count as being a job. So so we'll see some government layoffs next month. But we're also going to get a lot of other layoffs because businesses are going to start laying people off because they're going to know that their demand is going to collapse because all the prices are going to go up. Now, there might be an initial rush because some people might rush to the store to buy stuff before, the shelves are gone because the stuff that's already in the country escapes the tariffs. And I know from these huge trade deficits we've had over the past couple of months, there was some tariff front running going on. So you do have some inventory that people can buy. Now, some smart businesses will already start jacking up their prices because they'll realize this is their last chance to sell products. Because once they run out of inventory, the replacement inventory is going to be too expensive for the customers to buy. So that might delay some of the decline. But, I think we're going to see a lot more weak economic data. But I think the markets are wrong. I don't think this is a global recession. I think it's a global disruption, but the world is going to be better off, assuming that we can actually get the world to stop supplying us with consumer goods and the world keeps their own goods. The world will be better off. If the world stops buying treasuries and US dollar denominated debt, the world will be better off, especially the emerging markets. So what Trump may have succeeded in liberating in Liberation Day is the rest of the world. They've been liberated from the burden of supporting the U.S. market. Now, they may have to pay for their own defense, right? Because that was part of the trade-off. Hey, you keep our dollar as the reserve currency. You lend us all this money to buy stuff. And if anything happens to you, we'll send our military, we'll send our aircraft carriers, and we'll take care of your problem. But if we're saying, hey, we're not going to protect you unless you pay, well, all right, well, then if we're going to have to pay for our own defense, then why are we supporting your entire economy? Why are we sending you all these consumer goods and buying all your bonds at these low interest rates? So I don't think if the dollar goes back to what it was doing, right? The dollar was way down yesterday. It only rallied in response to China with the retaliation. And I think that's because people are worried about a slowdown in China. And China is a big buyer of commodities. But you know what? I think the world's got it wrong. It's America that's going to slow down dramatically. I think without having to drag the weight of the U.S. consumer, the world will prosper. So I think after some hiccups, as I said, and I've made this analogy before, it's like World War II. During World War II, at the end of the war, 1944, it became obvious that we were going to win. There were a lot of politicians or a lot of economists at the day that were concerned about what would happen to the economy when the war ended, because all of our factories were making stuff for the war. We were making weapons. We were making tanks and bombs and fighter planes and, all kinds of stuff to support 10 million, 20 million, I forget, soldiers in Europe and Japan. And what were these soldiers going to do? They were going to be unemployed, right? What was going to happen to them? And of course, what they forgot is that before factories were making tanks, they were making automobiles. Before they were making weapons, they were making sewing machines and washer dryers. We still had the factories. We just retooled them to make different stuff. And when the war ended, we didn't have an economic bust. We had an economic boom because we stopped making weapons and started making the consumer goods. And so we just, redirected our productive capacity away from the military to the consumer. When all of our factories were making bombs, consumers were going without stuff. We were rationing things. It was hard to buy anything in America in 42, 43. Everything was rationed because all the resources were going to the military. So Americans suffered to help win the war. Well, it's the same thing right now in China and the rest of the world. They've got all the factories. They're producing stuff for us, just like we were using our factories to produce for the military. So if they're not going to produce stuff for us anymore, They still have the factories. They still have the workers. They still have the supply chains. All they got to do is change what they're making. And in many cases, they don't have to change. You don't think people in China want washer dryers or dishwashers, or you don't think Chinese kids want to play with toys? Sure they do. Maybe the toys are a little different. Maybe they're going to look Chinese instead of American. So you tweak the mold a little bit. Yeah, maybe there's a factory making American flags. Okay, they make Chinese flags. But a lot of the products are going to be the same. But some of the products might be different. But so what? Our factories were able to go from making cars to making tanks, right? So if you can make that switch, right? The Chinese factories, they have all of this stuff, all of this infrastructure that we don't have. See, China's problem is not only easy, but fun, and the rest of the world. All they have to do is consume what they make. Easy, fun. We have to figure out how to make what we don't make. We can't consume unless we make stuff. So what's easier? To take a factory that already exists and tweak it a little bit to create something a little bit different? Or, shipping routes, or, instead of making something and sending it to America, you send it someplace else? That's not that hard. Our task is what's hard. We have to build factories out of nothing. We have to, recreate supply chains out of nothing. We have to create non-existent infrastructure. And we have to train workers. The workers in China who are already making things can keep making things, or they'll make something slightly different. But we don't have anybody making these things. So we have a Herculean task ahead of us that is going to require a massive capital investment that we can't afford to make if we're funding this massive government at the same time. So we have a huge day of reckoning. They have a jubilee coming. They have a liberation. They have prosperity. And that is the very basis of my whole investment strategy, is to own companies outside the United States that will benefit from the emergence of the global middle class when they are no longer propping up the U.S. So that's what's going to happen. And again, the problem that I have with all this, I want to do what Trump wants to do, but I know it's not going to work because Trump is not leveling with the public on the sacrifice that we need. He's telling us everything is going to boom. And when it doesn't boom, we're going to go back to the same old problem of printing money, QE, artificially low interest rates, right? Trump is demanding low interest rates. Low interest rates are part of the problem. That's why we have these huge deficits. We don't encourage savings. If we don't have savings, we can't make the capital investments to build the factories. And so we depend on foreign factories that foreigners build with their savings. And so we need foreign savings and we need foreign goods. We are the country that's been ripping off the world, not the other way around. But anyway, so I think this is a head fake. The drop that we saw today in the foreign stocks, the rise in the dollar, the drop in gold, this is all yet another opportunity to move money out of U.S. assets, which are still very overpriced. Even though they've fallen, they got a long way to go down. But foreign assets still have a long way to go up. The dollar has a long way to fall. So remember, go to Europac.com. Gold stocks were down like 9% today. 10, crazy. Now, they were up almost 30% on the year, so they're still doing good this year. But in one day, they gave back a third of their gains. If you could still buy them this cheap on Monday, do it. Even if they get cheaper, who cares? And again, my gold fund is EPGIX. Everybody keeps making fun of me because I get the symbol wrong. Hopefully, I got it right this time, EPGIX. But you could buy that. Only problem is you have to wait till the close on Monday to buy it. You can't buy the open in case there's a recovery. But Monday, could be a Black Monday. We had 2 down days, Thursday and Friday. It's a long weekend. Who the hell knows what's going to happen? Maybe Trump will up the ante on China and retaliate again, because as far as I know, China came back with a 34% tariff. Trump hasn't matched that. It's like a poker game, and they keep throwing these tariffs, into the pot. I'll see your tariffs and I'll raise you, right? What's Trump going to do? He's going to re-raise the Chinese. So who the hell knows? It could be a long weekend. By the way, Bitcoin held up. People are making a big deal out of the fact that Bitcoin actually rose slightly today. I think one of the reasons that Bitcoin rose was because gold tanked, and it's negatively correlated with Bitcoin. Now, it's positively correlated with the NASDAQ, so it should have tanked. But Bitcoin is already in a bear market. It's down 25% from its peak. But you know what? I wouldn't be surprised to see Bitcoin have a delayed tank over the weekend, which would actually be very problematic for a lot of the people who own the ETFs, because they're going to have to sweat it out. Because if they got conned into buying Bitcoin today because of, oh, see, it's a safe haven, it's not going down. Look, Bitcoin, right? If Bitcoin crashes on Saturday or Sunday, they have to just sit and watch it. And they have to wait for Monday morning to get any liquidity. So we'll see. I think that these guys were prematurely doing a victory dance because gold was down one day and Bitcoin was up. Anyway, this has been a long podcast. I didn't mean to talk so long. At least my voice held up. So I will be back doing more podcasts, hopefully with a better voice next week. So bye for now.